Happy Monday, everybody, and welcome back to the Creative Writing Lab. Today, we will be talking about joy, happiness, delight. For me personally, and when I think about the world globally, it seems like a bit of a stretch to talk about joy or happiness right now. It seems like a bit of a reach, which is why I think it's a great idea to search for them, to look for them, and to read about them today. We hear about a lot of morose poets and writers, ache, melancholy, passions that are more inclined towards rage and suffering and even redemption and victory tend to have a tinge of loss to them. And so, what about joy? How do we write joy? Why should we write about joy? Why are happiness and joy so hard to write about? Here's a poem, a section of a poem that tackles just that. It is difficult to know what to do with so much happiness. With sadness, there is something to rub against, a wound to tend with lotion and cloth. When the world falls in around you, you have pieces to pick up, something to hold in your hands like ticket stubs or change. But happiness floats. It doesn't need you to hold it down. It doesn't need anything. Happiness lands on the roof of the next house, singing, and disappears when it wants to. You are happy either way. So this poem kind of, when I read this poem, I think about how happiness can seem elusive. It can also seem to can also seem like when we have it, it's hard to write the details of it. And I love that last line in this section. You are happy either way. So happiness as being something that we can have right here and right now, no matter what our actual circumstances and situation um, are. I want to talk today about Ross Gay and his book, his collection, which is called The Book of Delights. So in 2016, Ross Gay decided that he was going to write about one joyous, delightful thing every single day. And he did. And he wrote one, at least one through 2017. So he wrote this book through an American election that really devastated and shook things up for a lot of people, through a lot of terrible times that tested us all and revealed a lot of the damage and cruelty that had been seething below the surface of our lives and worlds, especially for him being an African American man. Um, he actively chose delight in a time that could have been focused on um, suffering, and there's plenty of suffering, right? So he says about starting this project, I came up, and I'm quoting him, I came up with a handful of rules. Write a delight every day for a year. Begin and end on my birthday, August 1st. Draft them quickly, write them by hand. The rules made it a discipline for me, he says, a practice. Spend time thinking and writing about delight each day. He says that in almost every single instance of our lives, our social lives, we are, if we're paying attention, in the middle of an almost constant, if subtle, caretaking. We hold doors open for each other. We offer elbows at crosswalks. He says we let someone else go first. Help with heavy bags, reach when things are too high. Our tall friends will know this. Pulling someone back to their feet, stopping at a car wreck. He talks about stopping at a struck dog. He says that caretaking is our default mode, and it's always a lie. that convinces us to act or believe otherwise. Sort of some of the learning he had from this year of writing delights. When he thinks about that time of writing these essays or essayettes, as he calls them, he thinks of them as really grounded in dailiness, and calls it a practice of witnessing one's delight, of being in and with one's delight. And he says that this requires vigilance. It requires attention. It also requires faith that delight will arrive daily. Here's one that I really liked. Um, he says that delight is a sort of interdependence. And so, one really wonderful example of it that I found in the book was the delight and joy of receiving a high five from a stranger. So, I'm going to read this to you. So I settled into a coffee shop, took my notebooks out, and I was reading over these delights, transcribing them into my computer. And while I was working, headphones on, swaying to the new De La Soul record, Delight, I noticed a white girl. She looked 15, but could have been, I suppose, a college student, standing next to me with her hand raised. I looked up, confused, pulled my headphones back, and she said, like a coach or something, "Working on your paper? Good job to you. High five." And so he goes on to say, "And you better believe I high fived that child in her pre ripped Def Leppard shirt and her itty bitty Doc Martens, for I delight in unequivocally pleasant public physical interactions with strangers." Um, I thought this was just a really charming moment of happiness that comes from interdependence and really illustrates what he's talking about. He even talks about sorrow being potential joy if that sorrow is shared. I'm going to read this section to you again. "Among the most beautiful things I've ever heard anyone say came from my student, Bethany, talking about her pedagogical aspirations or ethos, how she wanted to be a teacher, and what she wanted her classroom to be. What if we joined our wilderness together?" she said. Sit with that for a moment. That the body, the life, might carry a wilderness, an unexplored territory, and that yours and mine might be somewhere, somehow. They might meet, might even join. And what if the wilderness, perhaps the densest wilder in there, thickets, bogs, swamps, uncrossable ravines, and rivers, is our sorrow? It astonishes me sometimes, no, often, how every person I get to know, everyone, regardless of everything, by which everything lives with some profound personal sorrow. Is sorrow the true wild? And if it is, and if we join them, your wild to mine, what's that? For joining too is a kind of annihilation of that sorrow. What if we joined our sorrows? I'm saying, what if that is joy? Again, this is from the Book of Delights. Delight, as Ross Gay shows me, is something to be courted, something to be sought out, romanced. It requires attentiveness. Um, it requires us really, really connecting deeply, meaningfully, fully with each other, with strangers, with family, with anybody we can. And I think of delight, happiness, joy, thanks to Ross Gay in part, the same way I do. I think of the idea of faith. You you can't wait for circumstances, and you can't wait for big events to be able to feel joy. You have to strive to have it and pay attention to have it. So, writing joy, I think Ross Gay shows us, is much the same. We can write joy as poets, as fiction writers, as memorists in those tiny, daily, beautiful moments. Especially in the time of COVID, it's hard to understand how we can feel connection and joy and bliss. And some of us, many of us, most of us, um, our interactions have been compressed, right? And we don't have that physical intimacy, let's say, with strangers as much anymore. That those daily interactions. Here's a poem that really shows us how joy and how attentiveness and delight in another life are possible even within the confines of our rooms and whatever other confines our lives are placing upon us now. This is called The Flower at My Window. It's by Lucien B. Watkins. Again, I'm reading just a section of it. Oh, my heart now feels so cheerful as I go with footsteps light in the daily toil of my dear home. And I'll tell you the secret that now makes my life so bright. There's a flower at my window in full bloom. It is radiant in the sunshine and so cheerful after rain. It is very, very lovely. May its beauties never wane. The dear flower at my window in full bloom. I really liked this poem because Lucien B. Watkins, he was born in 1878 and died in 1920. And yet, this poet really captures um, a way for us to experience joy right now, right here in a pandemic, for example. I also think that it's quite lovely how rain, gloom, which is usually associated with gloom, is not just dispelled by the image of this flower, but also in the poem, it seems like the rain might be what nourishes the flower, what makes it more beautiful. Of course, the flower is something small, brief, beautiful, fleeting, not long for this world, and yet it symbolizes joy. We know, though, that the flower will wilt, and still, joy can be eternal, even though our current forms are not. So, how do we write that? How do we write the eternity, the possibility of joy being eternal? Here's Joy Harjo with For Keeps, um, who kind of illustrates this really magnificently. She says, sun makes the day new. Tiny green plants emerge from the earth. Birds are singing the sky into place. There is nowhere I want to be but here. I lean into the rhythm of your heart to see where it will take us. We gallop into a warm southern wind. I link my legs to yours and we ride together towards the ancient encampment of our relatives. Where have you been? They ask, and what has taken you so long? That night, after eating, singing, and dancing, we lay together under the stars. We know ourselves to be part of mystery. It is unspeakable, it is everlasting, it is for keeps. What a powerful poem. I especially love that it captures that sense of community. It captures how something that can often be fearful, death, the afterlife, what happens after, the loneliness, and the fear we culturally often feel about death. This poem sort of sings past that and sings joy through and past and into that. And it says that it is for keeps, it's forever, essentially. I truly think, at least for me, fear is the ultimate enemy of happiness. When I give into fear, is when happiness is very much out of reach. Just like we talked about attentiveness before, attentiveness requires me being right here in the present as I'm talking to you, with the poinsettias next to me, really, really completely living in the now. But fear usually arises because I am dwelling in the past or in the future and only imagining the worst out of them. And that Just as attentiveness lends itself to happiness, fear lends itself to misery. So I want to end this episode with two passages from the 14th century Sufi mystic and poet Hafiz, who was a contemporary of Dante, but just a bit more joyous, I think, than Dante. Here's the first one. Fear is the cheapest room in the house. I would like to see you living in better conditions. For your mother and my mother were friends. I know the innkeeper in this part of the universe. Get some rest tonight. Come to my verse tomorrow. We'll go speak to the friend together. It's a really powerful metaphor. Um, Fear being the cheapest room in the house, um, the low hanging fruit, the easiest to slip into, um, and how inhabiting other rooms is Hafiz's recommendation. I think it's really powerful. Here's another excerpt from Hafiz. Ever since happiness heard your name, it has been running through the streets, trying to find you. And several times in the last week, God Himself has come to my door so sweetly, asking for your address, wanting the beautiful warmth of your heart's fire. You don't have to be a believer in God at all to believe in happiness and to imagine joy stalking you in the best way, in a healthy way, looking for you, waiting for you ever since you were born. And, the possibility of finding them in a stranger's eyes, in a flower, in an entire immense universe. Let's do a writing prompt. Your prompt is to describe a moment of daily, perfect delight or happiness in as much detail, with as much love and as much warmth as you can. Just as an example, the one I'm going to describe is from a couple of years ago. I took a walk when I was really, really sad, and I went to the beach and I watched a man, a complete stranger, teach his puppy how to swim. It took about an hour for the puppy to get the hang of it, but that final moment when the puppy got it, after his person's patience, was just so delightful. They were both so happy, and it was just so beautiful. So I'm going to write about that moment. Um, your moment of delight, happiness can be as small or as large as you like. I'm going to set a timer. Let's begin. All right, we're done. Thank you very much for listening with me, for writing with me. I hope you have a delightful week, um, and can have your own experience of daily attentiveness and daily delights. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you next week.